All right, one of the last groups to look at in the flowering plant group is the monocots. So this is actually a whole group of plants, a whole class within the flowering plants. It includes lots of different families, as you can see here. The orchid family is actually one of the most diverse plant families in the world, not well represented in Washington State, but there are a few interesting examples. So let's meet about a dozen of these, and they're pretty wide ranging. A lot of them are very grass like cattails over here on the right, and even grasses themselves, like you see forming hay here, are very important in terms of crop plants. So not only hay, but wheat, rice, corn are all in the grass family. But some look decidedly ungrass-like, like the skunk cabbage and most orchids. So pretty diverse group of plants. So here they are on the plant family tree. Up here are the monocots. So most of the time we've been studying the dicots over here, but this time we're going to skip those and look at the rest of the angiosperms, the rest of the flowering plants. So in Washington State we have the grass-like plants, we have orchids, we have those that are kind of tulip-like or onions and things like that. The only one we don't have is palm trees. Definitely not there. How do you know you have a monocot? They're almost always herbaceous plants. Their leaves, like you see over here, are usually pretty linear, and they have usually veins that run parallel to each other. Unlike most of the dicots that had kind of that classic branching pattern on their leaves, monocots typically don't do that. Their flowers usually have parts of 3 or 6. Quite often, like on this lily over here, we can't really distinguish which is a petal and which is a sepal, so sometimes we call them tepals. But usually 3 or more commonly 6, except for grasses that have really bizarre flowers, which we'll only briefly touch on. And then the fruit is almost always a dry capsule. So there's a brief introduction to the monocots. Let's start off with wild onion, which is definitely one of those grass-like plants. When you see it over here on the right, you can see that it looks kind of like grasses. There's a bunch of grasses in the background here, and they kind of blend right in with their linear leaves. Well, if you were to pluck one of those leaves out, you'd notice it's quite a bit more succulent, and if you hold it to your nose, it's going to smell oniony. And then it has these flowers. Grasses themselves don't have flowers like this, not showy flowers with a nice 6 tepals and stigmas and styles kind of hanging out of them. These guys occur in a flower arrangement we've seen before, which is an umbel. Looks like, remember, fireworks that just exploded from that one point. So that's onions. Not surprisingly, onions, if this is the ground and these are the leaves that come up above ground, underground they grow a bulb, an onions, even the wild onions. So the onions that we eat are actually this bulb made of modified leaves that store food underground so the plant can get going the next spring. Good survival strategy and a tasty treat. Although these, I gotta warn you, are extremely pungent, so probably not one you want to put in an omelet. Then there's Camas. This one is an edible plant and an incredibly important one in the Northwest. This one grows in meadows, usually at somewhat higher elevations, but same sort of thing. In my drawing over here on the left, you can see that bulb below, and that's what people would dig up and use for food. It has a lot of starch in it. Beautiful flowers on these guys with these 6 tepals. Looks very much like a small lily. Again, kind of grass-like leaves, although a little bit wider in most cases. But there's Camas, very important plant of central Washington. There's one close relative of Camas that you'd want to watch out for. As you see there on the right by its name, you kind of understand why. Wouldn't want to mix these up. Flower arrangement's a little bit different. Some Camas flowers can be almost white, and so would be easier to confuse, but definitely not one you want to try nibbling on unless you are absolutely certain, because death camas will kill you. Beargrass. This is an interesting one that to me always feels a little out of place. I'm used to growing up in the desert Southwest, and so I'm used to yuccas and plants kind of like that. These plants always feel like they belong there to me instead of up in the mountains and forested areas. But there it is. So Beargrass is an evergreen, which is a bit of a strange one for most monocots. It has 6 showy tepals on its flowering stalk, and these flowering stalks get pretty tall. They'll be up to 1.5 meters, a little over waist high when they flower. They're kind of hard to catch in flower, usually around May or June. Kind of looks like somebody left a couple of marshmallows on a stick to come back and roast later. So there's the arrangement there. Usually you catch them afterward and see their dry capsules hanging out. The base of these is perennial, and apparently bears really like to come and dig them up with their powerful claws and eat the bases. More often I see the tops nibbled off, usually before they actually flower. The deer and elk come and nibble off those tops. It seems like it would make it pretty difficult to set seed and spread, a little harder to survive as a plant like this, especially since they only flower like every 5 years. But they do spread underground as well, so with those stout underground rhizomes, they will spread and send up new bunches once in a while. Also a good survival strategy since they do live in forests that burn. You see a bunch here in the middle photo popping up after a fire. So they actually do pretty well for themselves by keeping a lot of their stores underground. So there's Beargrass in the bunch flower family, another part of the monocot group. Another member of the bunch flower family group is the corn lily, or false hellebore. You'll find this in meadows all throughout the western United States. It just towers above all the rest of the meadow plants, kind of like a skyscraper in a cornfield. Very noticeable. Showy just in that respect, but even though it has lots and lots of flowers, not the most photogenic. Just these 6 tepals that are kind of yellowish green. Not particularly something that you just want to run over and take a picture of, but they're dramatic plants. They come up from thick underground rhizomes, start poking up right after the snow melts. They're toxic to us, but bugs seem to like them. You can see their leaves just usually seem riddled with holes. They got covered with aphids, and then the ants come after those. But an easy plant to spot, and it stands out so much that anytime you go out and you pass through a meadow, you're likely to say, "What is that?" And now you know the answer. We don't have a lot of true lilies within Washington State, but the ones we do have are gorgeous. Actually, all throughout the western U.S., we have these orange-petaled lilies, a few different species. So ours is the Columbia lily, and they really just tower up there. You find them kind of reaching chest high with a big bunch of lilies up here. They have 6 tepals that kind of curl back, and with those brown spots, you kind of see why they're called tiger lilies. They have an interesting arrangement on their leaves. The leaves are whorled on the stem, so a lot of leaves coming out of the same spot on the stem. But these you'll just spot here and there. They're very photogenic, so see if you can get a good picture of one next time you're out and share it with maybe your mom. This is just like the lilies that you should buy your mom for Mother's Day. That's coming up, by the way. Cattails are one of those in the monocot group that look very grass-like, but giant grasses. These can form kind of an 8-foot tall lawn in just about any marsh, and you find them all over the world. There's hardly a place in the world that you wouldn't find cattails. Okay, Antarctica, of course. But if you have a marshy wetland, you probably have cattails in it. They have these long leaves that come out of stout stems. Sometimes these are called bulrushes as well. And they have an interesting arrangement of flowers, really kind of unexciting flowers, but they put the female flowers down below and the male flowers up above. Kind of looks like a little upside down corn dog. And then when the female flowers are pollinated, they form seeds that hang on for a while, and the next season just blow off like a bunch of fluff, kind of like cottonwoods on the wind. They're specially adapted to wetlands because in these tall leaves, they have really spongy, air-filled cells that actually act like snorkels and carry air down to the roots so that the roots don't drown, which is a major problem with plants around wetland areas. Pretty clever. Finally, on to the orchid family, and this one is western coralroot, although we have quite a few orchids. This is one you're probably most likely to run into. It is out there in the forest, kind of blends in with its background to a certain extent. All orchids, and orchids, by the way, are the most diverse plant family on the planet. Most of them live in the tropics or maybe in kitchen windows, but they like humid environments. But we have a surprising number here in Washington state. They seem to like soils with a lot of organic matter, so that's where you're going to find them. And then you either find them in the deep forest or out in meadows. So western coral root is one you find in the deep forest. Doesn't need a lot of sun because it's saprophytic. You can see all three stages here from beginning to middle to end of its life, and not once is it green. It's stealing nutrients from fungi underground, which are getting them by breaking down that organic matter, which makes more sense why you find it there. But here you see it sending up its stem above the ground. Here are the flowers. It's got these three petals and then this hood down below with brown spots. And so kind of a bizarre sort of arrangement. Every orchid has its own bizarre arrangement of flower petals. They don't really fit the sort of lily or onion or beargrass type of arrangement. They're really bilaterally symmetrical, unlike the radially symmetrical rest of the group. And then they form these dry capsules that produce lots of tiny little seeds. Now, western coralroot is not the only orchid. There are quite a few others in the state as well. These are the ones that tend to be green and live out in the open, usually in kind of boggy, organic matter soils and meadows. This one in the middle, the lady slipper, is probably most likely to remind you of one that you'd find in the florist shop. The others have their own unique beauty, but that one usually is kind of showy and stands out. So go hunting for them. They're worth the show and worth the effort to find them. They are really a unique treasure we have in the state. Not all flowering plants look like they're flowering, but the grass-like plants, and there are quite a few of them, are really kind of the workhorses of the plant kingdom. Like I said before, grasses make up things like wheat and rice and corn, so they're really important. They're also important for stabilizing soils. I'll just introduce you to one of the native species of grasses that we have, Bluebunch wheatgrass. There are about 300 species of grass in the state. Easy to say that they all look pretty much alike. Grasses have their own specialized terminology, their own specialized parts and structures, so to really learn them well requires a very specialized type of study and a lot of attention to detail. So this one I just bring up because it's so widespread. If you find a big hillside with a bunch of bunch grasses, it's probably this one, Bluebunch wheatgrass. So we see it grows as a big bunch. So down at the base, it's perennial and it dies back each year to just that base, and then new stems grow out from the base each year. Flowers up at the top here, these have all been spent and the seeds cast away. Over here on the far right, we can see them against this dark background. These are just past flower and setting seed, so it's kind of this spike of flowers turning into seeds. Grasses have kind of a unique arrangement where their stems are hollow, for one, and around the stem is actually the petiole, or the leaf stalk. It clasps around the stem, gives it a big bear hug. And then the leaf blade comes out like a big pennant off of a flagpole and usually goes off at kind of a 90-degree angle from the stem. That's just one of the unique features of grasses and how they're arranged. So lots of important ones in the state. This just happens to be one. Many of them, while they're not endangered, are much rarer than they used to be. So the Bluebunch wheatgrass makes up most of the steppe part of the shrub steppe ecosystem in the Columbia Plateau. The grasses don't compete great with sagebrush, and the only places they can really outcompete them is on really nicer soils that hold water a little better. Most of the level areas that kind of meet that criteria have been turned into agricultural fields for obvious reasons. So usually where you see bluebunch wheatgrass is going to be on a slope somewhere, often on a north slope, and you find a little less of the sagebrush there. Now, a recent invader is cheatgrass, or sometimes just called cheat. Unlike most of our native grasses, this one is an annual, and so it springs up first thing in the spring, makes the hillsides look beautiful and green, and you think, oh, this is going to be a great year, it's going to be nice and green and lush. And then these things dry out, like you see over here on the left. So kind of by midsummer at the latest, these are forming kind of that cheatgrass brown that we have on the hillsides. You see it down here on the lower right. These are a pretty common weed. Their seeds drop and stick in your socks, which is part of the secret to their success. Not just socks, but sticking to animal fur and spreading around from place to place. And they have become extremely abundant and cause a lot of ecological problems throughout the entire western U.S. But there's cheatgrass. It's an important one to know just because of its significance, even if we don't really care for it that much. Some plants that look a lot like grasses and are not quite grasses, they're just grass-like plants, are the sedges. And often you'll hear the phrase, sedges have edges, whereas grasses have round stems, sedges have kind of triangular stems. So if you roll them in your fingers, you'll feel those edges in your fingertips. One of the other differences is their flowers. So these guys have female flowers here and male flowers separated, and most grass plants do not do that. The rest of the plant looks pretty similar. One other difference is sedges tend to favor wet areas and higher elevation areas. As we move up in elevation, it seems like sedges do better than grasses do. And so they kind of take over the higher in elevation you go. Grasses tend to be really good and hardy and drought tolerant. It's not to say they don't grow up in high elevations as well, but just a little more common to find sedges up in higher elevations and in wetter areas. So there's the sedge group. And then the last one that's very grass-like plant is a rush. And so there's a little poem that goes, sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have knees that bend to the ground. And so whereas sedges, like I just said, have edges, rushes are round, and grasses are round. And on their stems, they have these nodes where they kind of bend the stems. So grasses have those and others do not. The other thing is grasses have a hollow stem, whereas rushes have a solid stem in the middle. And then lastly, and I just can't get these to be real photogenic for me, you can see they do look grass-like, but hard to kind of capture. Maybe a little stouter. They do like wet areas, but their flowers are more floral. They have 6 tepals, usually, so it's a lot like a lily, except they're usually really small and tan, so they don't look really showy. One that you'll find commonly in the forest is the wood rush. That's a member of the rush family as well. It's not a true rush, but it has a similar arrangement, and you'll find it all over the forest floor. So there you go, grasses, sedges, and rushes. All very grass-like plants, not very showy, but like I said, kind of the workhorse of the plant kingdom when it comes to ground covers. Well, that's a lot to cover. All the monocots, just a few of them from around the states, a dozen in this episode, and always more to learn about those guys. But I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about this group of plants. Happy botanizing.